The chamber was massive and filled with beings from across the galaxy. Ambassador Lucas Grant stood at the human podium and tried to keep his face calm. His hands gripped the edge of the stand so hard his knuckles had turned white. He had been standing here for 3 hours now, and listening to the same complaints over and over again. The Xanthari representative kept reading from a list that seemed to have no end. His name was Vexthon, and he had 6 eyes that blinked one after another in a pattern that made Lucas feel dizzy if he watched too long. The complaints were all the same kind of thing. Humanity had expanded into a sector without filling out the right forms. Human mining operations had exceeded their quotas by a tiny amount. Human military ships had been detected near zones where they were not supposed to be. Every single complaint was technical and small. Lucas knew what this really was. This was not about rules or regulations. This was about control. The Council wanted to keep humanity in a box and make sure they never became too powerful or too independent. Lucas had been the human ambassador for 5 years now. 5 long years of smiling and nodding and apologizing for things that were not really problems. 5 years of watching the Council change the rules whenever humanity got close to achieving something. 5 years of seeing other species break the same rules without any consequences. The older species in the Council did whatever they wanted. But humanity was new, and humanity had to follow every single rule perfectly or face these long sessions of criticism. Something inside Lucas broke. He could not do this anymore. He had tried to play their game and follow their rules, but it was never going to be enough. They would always find something new to complain about. They would always move the finish line just before humanity reached it. Lucas stepped back from the podium and took a breath. The chamber grew quiet as everyone noticed his movement. Vexthon stopped reading and looked at him with all 6 eyes. Lucas spoke clearly so everyone could hear him. He said that humanity was withdrawing its petition for council membership. He said that starting right now humanity was cutting all diplomatic ties with the council. He said this was final and permanent. The silence that followed was complete. Even the machines that translated languages seemed to pause. Nobody had expected this. Species did not just leave the council. It was not done. It had never been done. Vexthon recovered first and his mandibles clicked together in agitation. He said that Lucas could not simply leave like this. He said there were protocols and procedures that had to be followed. His voice was sharp and angry. Lucas interrupted him. He said that according to the council's own charter, those protocols were voluntary for non-member species. He said humanity had been seeking candidacy, but now humanity was declining that candidacy. He was calm when he said this. He had checked the laws very carefully before coming here today. Lucas picked up his data tablet and pressed a button. The withdrawal notice went out to every single council member at the same time. It was official now. There was no taking it back. A serpentine creature named Councillor Sareth spoke up from her position across the chamber. She said that if humanity left council space, they would be alone. She said there would be no trade agreements and no defense pacts. She said humanity would not be able to use the hyperspace lanes that the council maintained. Her voice was meant to sound threatening, but Lucas could hear the uncertainty in it. Lucas allowed himself a small smile. He said that humanity would manage just fine. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. His assistant followed him and neither of them looked back. The news reached Earth within hours. President Helen Morris was in her office in Geneva when the encrypted message came through. She read it twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she looked up at her chief of staff. His name was Vincent Cole and he had been a Marine before joining her administration. He was a practical man who did not waste words. Vincent asked if the council really thought humanity would stay after all this. Helen said that they thought humanity had no choice. She said they believed humanity needed the council more than the council needed humanity. Then she told Vincent to call the cabinet together. She said if humanity was going to do this, they had to do it properly. The orders went out within hours. Human ships that were in council space started finishing their current jobs and not taking new ones. Diplomats and staff at council installations began packing their belongings. Military observers submitted formal resignations. Everything was done quietly and professionally. There was no drama and no angry statements. Humanity simply started leaving. The council noticed, but they did not believe it was real. They thought this was a negotiating tactic. They thought humanity was trying to scare them into offering better terms. They believed that within a few weeks humanity would come back and ask to rejoin. They believed humanity would have no choice because no species could survive outside the council system. But weeks passed, and humanity kept leaving. Ships departed and did not return. Diplomatic offices were closed and locked. Human personnel boarded transports and went home. The withdrawal was complete and total. In the council chamber, Vexthon assured the other members that this was temporary. He said humanity would realize their mistake soon. He said they would come back begging for readmission. He said no species in the history of the galaxy had ever survived long outside the council system. It was economically impossible and politically suicidal. The other council members wanted to believe him. They had built their entire civilization around the idea that the council was necessary. They could not imagine a species choosing to leave voluntarily. It went against everything they understood about how the galaxy worked. But somewhere in the back of their minds a small doubt had appeared. What if Vexthon was wrong? What if humanity really could survive alone? What if the council was not as necessary as they had always believed? These thoughts were uncomfortable, so most of the council members pushed them away. They chose to believe that humanity would fail and come, crawling back. They would spend the next several years learning just how wrong they were. 3 months had passed since humanity walked out of the council chamber, and still there was no sign of them returning. Councillor Vexthon stood before an emergency session and tried to maintain his confident appearance, but cracks were starting to show. The other council members were asking questions and demanding answers. They wanted to know when humanity would come back and admit they had made a mistake. Commander Thelnax was the head of council security, and he delivered his report in a flat, emotionless voice. He said that all human vessels had completely withdrawn from council-regulated space. He said that humans had established what looked like defensive positions around their core systems. He said that every attempt to contact humanity had been ignored. Human borders were closed and human officials were not responding to any messages. Councillor Brevik was a member of the merchant guilds, and he laughed when he heard about the defensive positions. He said humanity had no enemies except their own foolish pride. He said they were wasting resources on defenses they did not need. Several other council members nodded in agreement, but Thelnax was not finished with his report. He said that trade requests sent to human space were being rejected without explanation. He said that council envoys were being turned away at human borders. He said that humanity was acting as if the council simply did not exist. This was the part that worried him most. Species did not ignore the council. Species could not afford to ignore the council. Back on Earth, deep in the mountains of Colorado, a military installation had been converted into the new Strategic Command Center. Admiral Kate Brennan stood in front of a massive holographic display that showed all of human-controlled space. The display made human territory look very small compared to the vast expanse of council space. Kate was briefing the assembled military and civilian leadership on humanity's new strategy. She explained that humanity was pulling back and consolidating. Every ship was being recalled and refitted with the best technology humans could build. Every colony was being pushed toward complete self-sufficiency. Nothing was being left to chance. Humanity was building for survival over the long term. They were preparing to exist without the council for decades if necessary. Dr. Paul Henderson was the civilian science advisor, and he raised his hand nervously. He said that the projections showed humanity might be isolated for a very long time. He said the psychological impact on human populations could be severe. People were used to being part of a larger galactic community. Being cut off completely might cause serious problems. Kate cut him off gently but firmly. She said that Dr. Sullivan's psychology team was already working on that problem. She said right now the priority had to be survival. She said the council believed humanity would collapse without their support, and humanity needed to prove them completely wrong. A man named Leon Carter was the new director of colonial affairs, and he leaned forward in his chair. He asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. He asked what would happen if the council was right. What if humanity really could not make it alone? What if this whole thing was a terrible mistake? Kate looked at him with hard eyes. She said that if humanity failed, then at least they would fail while building something of their own. She said it was better to go down fighting for independence than to live on their knees in someone else's empire. The room fell silent after that. Nobody had a response to such determination. Meanwhile, back in Council space, the economic effects were starting to become visible. Human products had never dominated galactic markets, but they had filled important niches. Human manufacturing was efficient and their techniques were unique. Human entertainment had become surprisingly popular, especially among younger members of various species. Human mercenaries and military trainers were highly valued for their effectiveness. All of that was gone now. Counselor Mira was the Plekian trade representative, and she delivered bad news to the council. She said the Rim colonies were experiencing a 20% shortage in medical supplies. She said humans had been the primary supplier of those materials. She said they were trying to find alternatives, but it was proving difficult. Bexton waved a dismissive claw and told her to simply find other suppliers. He made it sound easy. Mira's face showed frustration, but she continued her report. She explained that human production methods were unique, and their synthetic medical compounds had properties that nobody else had been able to replicate. Finding alternatives was not as simple as Vexton seemed to think. Similar reports came in from across Council space. Agricultural equipment that humans had manufactured was breaking down, and there were no replacement parts. Starship components that humans had specialized in were suddenly unavailable. Exotic materials that human miners had been particularly good at extracting were in short supply. None of these things were critical to the Council's immediate survival, but together they added up to significant inconvenience. Vexton tried to reassure the Council. He said that humanity would return once their resource reserves ran out. He said no species could truly stand alone in the modern galaxy. He said it was economically impossible for any civilization to be completely self-sufficient. The other council members wanted to believe him because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. Months continued to pass and turned into a full year. Humanity's silence remained absolute. No messages came from human space. No human ships appeared in council territory. No human diplomats reached out to negotiate. It was as if humanity had simply vanished from the galaxy. Some of the younger council species started to whisper among themselves. They wondered if humanity had found something that the council did not know about. They wondered if maybe the council system was not as necessary as everyone had always believed. These whispers were quickly silenced by the older species, but the questions had been planted. In human space, something remarkable was happening. Without the weight of council regulations and restrictions, humanity was innovating at an incredible pace. Problems that had seemed impossible to solve suddenly had solutions when human engineers and scientists were free to try unconventional approaches. Colonies that had relied on council imports were finding ways to produce everything they needed locally. The human economy was reorganizing itself around independence rather than integration. It was hard, and there were shortages and difficulties. Some colonies struggled more than others. Some people questioned whether leaving had been the right choice, but overall humanity was surviving and even starting to thrive. They were proving that a species could exist outside the council system. They were proving that the galaxy's rules could be rewritten. The council still believed humanity would fail eventually. They still waited for the inevitable return. They could not imagine that humanity might actually succeed in building something new. But deep down in places they did not want to acknowledge, some council members were starting to worry. What if they were wrong? What if humanity never came back? 2 years had passed since humanity left the council, and the changes were remarkable. Commander Jake Morrison piloted his patrol corvette through the outer boundary of the Armstrong system, which was one of humanity's newer colonies. He remembered what this place had looked like before the departure. Back then there had been one small orbital station and a few scattered settlements on the surface. Now the planet was surrounded by a network of defensive platforms, and the surface glowed with lights from expanding cities. The transformation was incredible. Jake opened a communication channel to colony control and reported that the perimeter was clear. The response came back quickly, telling him good hunting out there. Jake smiled at the casual language. Humanity had changed in more ways than just technology and infrastructure. People talked differently now. They sounded like frontier settlers instead of nervous candidates trying to impress the council. There was a confidence in human voices that had not been there before. On Earth, deep beneath the Arizona desert, Dr. Lisa Yang was working on solving humanity's biggest problem. The council controlled the main hyperspace lanes because they had spent thousands of years mapping them. These lanes were like highways through space that allowed fast travel between star systems. Without access to council lanes, human ships had to take much longer routes. This made trade and communication between human colonies slow and difficult. Lisa had been working on this problem since the day humanity left the council. She had a team of the best scientists and navigators that humanity could provide. Together, they were doing something that nobody had attempted before. They were finding completely new hyperspace lanes that bypassed council space entirely. Admiral Kate Brennan came to the Arizona facility for her monthly briefing with Lisa. The two women stood in front of a holographic star map that showed human-controlled systems. Lisa activated the display and new glowing lines appeared connecting the human worlds. These lines represented the new hyperspace routes that her team had discovered. Lisa explained that these routes were not as fast or as safe as the established council lanes. Some of them passed through regions of space that were more dangerous, but they belonged to humanity alone. The council had no maps of these routes and no control over them. Her team had already established 3 stable corridors, and they were mapping more every week. Kate studied the glowing lines carefully and asked how long it would take to create a complete network. Lisa said that basic connectivity between all major human systems would take about 5 years. A truly robust network with multiple routes and backup options would take closer to 10 years. Kate thought about this and then told Lisa to make it happen in 7 years. She said humanity needed to prove they could not just survive but actually thrive without the council. In the agricultural domes of Meridian Colony, a farmer named Greg Palmer was working on his own kind of innovation. Without imports from council space, humanity had to grow all of its own food. This had seemed like an impossible challenge at first, but human farmers were rising to meet it. Greg had pioneered new growing techniques that combined human knowledge with adapted alien crop species. Greg gave regular reports to the Colonial Assembly through holographic conferences. In his latest report, he explained that crop yields had increased by 40% over the past year. The hydroponic systems were performing better than anyone had projected. His team had successfully adapted 17 different council crop species to work with human growing methods. Food that had once been exotic imports were now being grown in human farms. Similar stories were happening across all of human space. Engineers were designing better ships without the restrictions of council safety regulations. Manufacturers were creating more efficient production methods. Scientists were making discoveries that had been impossible under council oversight. Being forced to stand alone had unleashed human creativity in ways that nobody had anticipated. Meanwhile, the council was experiencing problems of its own. What had started as minor inconveniences were growing into serious issues. Councillor Sareth called for a closed session to discuss what she called the human question. Her serpentine body was coiled tightly, which was a sign of agitation among her species. She said that the council needed to address the instabilities caused by humanity's absence. Vexthon responded dismissively and asked what instabilities she was talking about. He said there were only some minor supply issues and temporary market adjustments. He made it sound like everything was under control. Sareth's hood flared out in anger. She said the problems were far from minor. 3 major shipping companies had completely collapsed because they had relied on human-manufactured engine components. The Outer Rim colonies were experiencing civil unrest due to shortages of medical supplies. Council military recruitment was down, significantly because the human training officers were gone, and nobody else could match their effectiveness, Vexes, then waved a claw dismissively and insisted that all of these problems were man-ageable. He said the council had existed for 10,000 years. He said humanity was barely 2 centuries old as a spacefaring species. He said it was obvious that humanity needed the council more than the council needed humanity. Councillor Mira stood up to challenge this view. She said she had been reviewing the economic data very carefully. She said humans had never been major trading partners in terms of total volume, but they had been extremely efficient partners. They had filled specific gaps in council markets that were proving very difficult to replace. The longer humanity stayed away, the more obvious these gaps became. Vex then told them all to adapt. He said the council would find solutions to these problems. He said within another year, humanity would realize their mistake and come back asking to rejoin. He sounded confident when he said this, but some of the other council members were starting to have doubts. The truth was that the council had built their entire system around the assumption that membership was necessary for survival. They had created regulations and restrictions that made independent operation difficult. They had controlled access to hyperspace lanes and trade networks. They had made themselves seem indispensable. But humanity was proving that a species could survive and even prosper outside that system. This was a dangerous idea. If humanity could do it, then maybe other species could too. The younger species in the council were watching the human situation very carefully. They were seeing that alternatives existed. They were starting to ask questions about why the council needed so much control. These questions made the council leadership very uncomfortable. Vexton and the other senior council members told themselves that humanity would fail eventually. They had to believe this because if humanity succeeded, then everything the council had built was based on a lie. The idea that the council system was the only way civilization could function would be proven false. That was unthinkable, so they refused to think it. But reality does not care what people choose to believe. 4 years after humanity left the council, everything changed because of what Captain Ryan Cooper found. He was commanding an exploration vessel called the Magellan, and his mission was to map new hyperspace routes in uncharted regions of space. The work was slow and often boring, but it was important for building humanity's independent network. Ryan and his crew had been surveying an unnamed system when their sensors detected something that should not exist. Lieutenant Amy Foster was working at the science station when the readings came through. She called out to Ryan and told him he needed to see what she had found. The data showed a moon orbiting a gas giant in this system. The moon itself was unremarkable, but what was inside it definitely was not. The sensors had detected veins of processed metals running through the moon's crust in geometric patterns. These were not natural formations. This was construction. Someone had built something inside this moon a very long time ago. Ryan sent an immediate report back to Earth, and within 3 weeks a team of archaeologists arrived. Dr. Nina Reeves led the excavation team. She was one of humanity's best experts on ancient alien civilizations. When she first entered the excavated chamber deep inside the moon, she could hardly believe what she was seeing. The walls were covered in symbols and writing. In the center of the chamber sat what could only be described as a massive data archive or library. Nina spoke into her recording device with a shaking voice. She said these were not just ruins of an old settlement. This was a deliberate repository. Someone had built this place specifically to store information. The question was who had built it and what information had they wanted to preserve. It took months of careful work to access the data without damaging it. Human scientists had to develop entirely new methods of interfacing with technology that was millions of years old. But humanity had become very good at solving impossible problems over the past 4 years. Eventually, they cracked the encryption and began downloading the contents of the archive. What they found was staggering. The archive belonged to the precursors, who were the legendary ancient civilization that had supposedly vanished millions of years ago. Every spacefaring species knew stories about the precursors. They had been incredibly advanced and had left ruins scattered across the galaxy. But nobody knew what had happened to them or why they had disappeared. The Council had spent thousands of years searching for precursor technology, but had found only fragments and incomplete records. This archive was complete. It contained star charts showing regions of space that nobody had ever mapped. It contained technical specifications for technology far more advanced than anything the current galaxy possessed. And most importantly, it contained historical records that told the true story of what had happened to the precursors. President Helen Morris was now serving her second term, and she called an emergency meeting of her cabinet. She stood before them with a grim expression and shared what the archaeologists had discovered. The precursors had not vanished mysteriously. They had not been destroyed by some unknown catastrophe. They had left deliberately, and the reason they left was because of the Council. Vincent Cole, who was still serving as her chief of staff, brought up the translated historical documents on the main display. The records described a council that existed millions of years ago. It was different in many details, but the same in all the ways that mattered. It was controlling and restrictive and demanded absolute obedience from its members. The precursors had been independent and innovative. They had refused to submit to council authority, so the council had systematically isolated them and sabotaged them, and eventually forced them to leave known space entirely. Helen said quietly, that the council had buried this history. They had made sure that nobody would ever know that a great civilization had been driven away because they refused to obey. The current council probably did not even know this history themselves. It had been lost in the millions of years since it happened, but the precursors had made sure to record the truth before they left. Admiral Kate Brennan leaned forward and said there was more to discuss. The archive contained complete technical specifications for precursor technology. There were designs for hyperspace drives that were 10 times more efficient than anything currently in use. There were weapon systems that could revolutionize military power. There were shield generators and power sources and manufacturing techniques that would transform civilization. Everything was there waiting to be used. The cabinet chamber fell silent as everyone absorbed what this meant. Helen finally spoke and said that if humanity released this information, the Council's technological advantage would disappear overnight. The Council maintained much of their power through superior technology. If everyone had access to precursor designs, that advantage would be gone. Kate countered by saying that if humanity kept the information secret, they would gain an enormous advantage. They could build ships and weapons far superior to anything the Council possessed. They could become the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The temptation to keep this knowledge for themselves was obvious. Director Leon Carter spoke up and said that humanity had not left the Council just to become like them. He said that if they hoarded this knowledge, they would be no better than the Council they had walked away from. He said humanity had to be better than that. Vincent argued the opposite view. He said that if they shared this technology freely, they would lose their edge. He said the Council could use precursor technology against humanity. He said it would be foolish to give away such an advantage. The debate went back and forth for hours. Dr. Nina Reeves joined the meeting through a holographic link from the excavation site. She listened to the arguments and then suggested a third option. She said they should share the information with everyone except the Council leadership. She said they should distribute it directly to the member species and let them decide what to do with it. She said they should give the knowledge to the people, not to the governments that controlled them. Helen smiled when she heard this suggestion. She said it was delightfully seditious. Nina replied that humanity was already in rebellion against the established order. She said they might as well commit fully to that path. The idea was bold and dangerous and would cause chaos across Council space. It would also be absolutely devastating to the Council's power structure. The cabinet voted and the decision was unanimous. They would release the precursor archive to every species in the galaxy. They would do it in a way that made sure the information could not be suppressed or controlled. They would let it spread freely and see what happened. It was a calculated risk, but humanity had been taking those risks for 4 years now. The data was prepared carefully and distributed through dozens of channels simultaneously. It was uploaded to public networks and sent to universities and given to independent scientists. Within days, it had spread too far to be contained. Within weeks, every species in Council space had access to complete precursor technology. The galaxy would never be the same. 6 months after the precursor data spread across the galaxy, the Council was in complete chaos, and humanity was finally ready to talk again. The information had moved through Council space like wildfire, and nothing could stop it. Minor species that had been powerless for thousands of years suddenly had access to technology that made them equal to the major powers. Trade routes that had been monopolized by wealthy guilds were now accessible to everyone. The careful balance of power that the Council had maintained for millennia was collapsing. Ambassador Lucas Grant, who had walked out of the Council chamber 6 years ago, now stood before it once again. But everything was different this time. The chamber was packed far beyond its normal capacity. It was not just Council members present. Representatives from dozens of minor species who had never been allowed full participation were here. Species that had been denied voices for generations had come to witness this moment. The Council leadership looked small and diminished sitting in their seats. Councillor Vexthon opened the session, and his voice lacked all of its former authority. He said that the human delegation had requested this audience and the Council had granted it in the interest of galactic stability. He tried to sound like he was doing humanity a favor, but everyone in the chamber knew the truth. The Council needed this meeting far more than humanity did. Lucas stood at the podium and did not smile even though he wanted to. He thanked Vexthon for allowing him to speak. Then he said that humanity was not here to rejoin the Council. He said humanity was here to propose something completely different. A murmur ran through the chamber at these words. Lucas activated a holographic display that showed a new vision for galactic civilization. He said that for 6 years humanity had existed outside Council authority. He said that during those years humanity had not just survived but had actually thrived. He said humans had built their own trade networks and developed their own technologies. He said they had created a society based on cooperation instead of control. Vex then interrupted and his mandibles clicked angrily. He accused humanity of stealing precursor technology and releasing it to destabilize the Council. He said humanity had deliberately caused chaos across civilized space. Several of the older Council members nodded in agreement. Lucas remained calm and corrected him. He said humanity had released knowledge that belonged to all species. He said the Council had either hidden that knowledge or never bothered to search for it properly. He admitted that yes, the release had been destabilizing, but he said it had destabilized a system that was already broken and corrupt. The system had needed to break so something better could be built. He expanded the holographic display to show human space and all the new hyperspace lanes that had been mapped. He showed the network of free trading ports and shared research stations. He showed a model of cooperation that did not require central authority or forced compliance. Then he made his proposal. He said humanity wanted to create a new organization called the Confederation of Free Worlds. It would not be a council where a few powerful species dictated terms to everyone else. It would be a confederation where each species maintained complete sovereignty while cooperating on matters of mutual interest. Technology would be shared openly. Trade agreements would be voluntary. Defense would be collective, but participation would never be forced. Councillor Brevik laughed harshly and called it anarchy. He said Lucas was describing a system with no order and no control. He said it would collapse into chaos within years. Several other council members voiced similar objections. They could not imagine a civilization without hierarchy and control. Lucas replied simply that he was describing freedom. He said that judging by all the representatives who had traveled here today, humanity was not alone in wanting it. He gestured to the crowded chamber where dozens of species were listening intently. Many of them were nodding in agreement with his words. The debate that followed lasted for 3 days. The old council powers fought desperately to maintain their control. They argued that the current system had kept the galaxy stable for thousands of years. They said change would bring war and suffering. They painted the darkest possible picture of what would happen if the council fell. But their arguments fell on deaf ears because everyone could see that the council had already fallen. The precursor data had broken their monopoly on technology. Minor species were no longer powerless. The old order was dead whether the council leadership admitted it or not. Species after species stood to voice support for humanity's proposal. The Plekians, who had suffered under unfair trade restrictions for centuries, endorsed the Confederation idea immediately. The Ithran Compact, which was a loose alliance of mining colonies, pledged to join. Even some species that were current council members expressed interest in this new system. They were tired of being controlled by the senior members. They wanted the freedom to make their own choices. On the 4th day, the vote was called. It was not really a vote to approve humanity's plan. It was a vote on whether to dissolve the old Galactic Council entirely. The result was overwhelming. The council that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years was officially ended. In its place, the Confederation of Free Worlds was established. Humanity was one of the founding members but held no special authority. Every species in the Confederation had an equal voice regardless of how old or powerful they were. After the final session ended, Councillor Vex approached Lucas privately. The Zenthari looked tired and defeated. He said quietly that humanity had won. Then he asked if it had been worth the risk. Lucas considered the question carefully before answering. He said that 6 years ago, Vexthon had asked what humanity would do alone. He said they had shown the galaxy what they could do. But he said humanity had never wanted to be alone. They had only wanted to be free. He said there was an important difference between those two things. Vexthon blinked his 6 eyes in sequence, which was a sign of deep thought among his people. He said that perhaps Lucas was right. He said time would tell whether the Confederation worked better than the Council had. Lucas agreed and said that time would indeed tell. But he added that at least this time everyone would get to help write the rules instead of having rules imposed on them. Back on Earth, President Helen Morris watched news feeds showing celebrations across human space and beyond. Fireworks lit up the skies of a dozen worlds. People danced in the streets. Species that had never trusted each other before were shaking hands and tentacles and claws in friendship. Vincent Cole joined Helen on the observation deck of the government complex in Geneva. He said quietly that they had done it. They had actually succeeded. Helen nodded, but her expression remained serious. She said that now came the truly hard part. Vincent asked what she meant. Helen explained that winning the fight was one thing, but building something lasting was another. She said humanity had to prove that their words meant something. They had to build a system that actually worked better than what came before. They had to do it not just for humans, but for every species that had put their faith in this new Confederation. In orbit above Earth, Admiral Kate Brennan stood on the bridge of a new ship called the CNS, Unity. It was the flagship of the Confederation Defense Force. Captain Ryan Cooper stood beside her, preparing the ship for its first real voyage. Ryan asked where they should go. Kate looked at the star charts displayed before her. The charts showed not just human territory, but the growing network of Confederation worlds. All of them were connected by newly discovered hyperspace lanes and mutual agreements of cooperation. Kate told Ryan they were going everywhere. She said they had an entire galaxy to explore, and this time they were doing it on their own terms. She said humanity was no longer alone, but they were finally free. The Unity engines powered up, and the great ship moved forward into unexplored space. Behind it came ships from a dozen other species, all flying under the banner of the new Confederation. They were writing a new chapter in galactic history together. The Council had never expected humanity to leave. They had been even less prepared for what happened when humanity returned. But perhaps most importantly, they had never imagined that humanity's departure would inspire so many others to demand their own freedom. That was the real revolution. Not just that humanity had survived alone, but that they had shown everyone else that alternatives were possible. The galaxy would never go back to the way it was before. The age of the Council was over. The age of the Confederation had begun.